6. The SPI-B advisors. The way we have used fear as dystopian. SPI-B advisor. The idea of going back to so-called normal is a major area of consideration. There's a climate crisis coming and that's going to have to be dealt with. The way we have gone about adapting to the virus has been quite beneficial in terms of working patterns and reducing carbon. All the things we are going to have to go through to adjust to the new future. As the New Zealand Prime Minister put it, we need to build back better. There are challenging times ahead of us for the next 20 or 30 years, God help us. The most major crisis of humanity is starting. I see the weather patterns changing around me. I believe in climate change. It's already getting bad. These will have major impacts on the nature of the world around us. The new future. My blood chilled. I'd asked Clifford Stott if SPI-B had been tasked with thinking about how to bring the population out of lockdown, climb down from fear and back towards a normal society. Clifford Stott is a professor of social psychology and an expert in collective violence and riots, policing issues and management of crowds. He is one of the 4 members of SPI-B who agreed to speak with me. Another nominated her colleague who produces work which is fed into SPI-B. A sage advisor also agreed to be interviewed and, as before, the anonymous scientist who advises at Whitehall had plenty to say. I hadn't imagined that a SPI-B advisor would mentally segue from COVID to climate change when asked how to end lockdown. I silently wondered if he envisaged future lockdowns to reduce CO2 emissions. Boris Johnson made some drastic environment promises during the epidemic, pledging to build back better, including commitments to wind power and switching to electric vehicles. Point 1, and this is where we tap into my fears. If you ultimately concede that lockdown is a useful tool, you must concede that the tool may be used again. The government, wielding the tool, develops muscle memory. So do we. COVID-19 is not the last novel virus. It's not the last crisis. Would you accept another lockdown for a future epidemic? Could we do another lockdown without laying waste to our economy and society? Would you go along with another lockdown for a run on the banks, an act of terror, or a food shortage? How about regular lockdowns to reduce CO2 emissions? How about every winter to reduce deaths from flu? Would our fear be deliberately elevated again to make us comply? Welcome to my raw nerve, strummed by Stott's answer. If you think this is an exaggeration, Speaker Lindsay Hoyle demonstrated an appetite for a lockdown, or restrictions of some sort, for the environment. At the G7 speakers meeting in September he said, "If one lesson from the pandemic is that taking serious action in a timely manner is key, then shouldn't this also be true in terms of climate change?" With COVID, what surprised many of us in the UK was how engaged most of the population became once the seriousness of the situation was made clear. People were prepared to accept limitations on personal choice and lifestyle, for the good of their own family and friends. No one could ever imagine that we would be wearing masks so readily and that we would all be so compliant. Perhaps we ought not to underestimate the ability of people and communities to work together for the common good, if there is united and clear leadership. They never imagined we would be so compliant. It's widely accepted that the government uses polling company YouGov to test the waters before announcing new policies. In mid-January 2021, YouGov started probing how lockdowns might have affected public concern for the environment. The survey tested agreement with attitudes such as, the short-term positive impact coronavirus has had on wildlife and ecosystems has encouraged me to make better environmental and sustainable decisions, and the importance of reducing your carbon footprint since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. To understand how our fear had been leveraged against us in the UK, I needed to get to know the people who suggested frightening us. I approached most of the advisors on SPI-B for an interview. Nearly all of them ignored me or turned me down. They probably fielded many media requests alongside their advisory work and regular jobs, but it wasn't necessarily wise to nail my lockdown skeptical colors to the mast in a series of articles and tweets in 2020 before writing this documentary book. My contributors might have thought me biased because I clearly wasn't a lockdown supporter. The fact is, we are all biased. It is unavoidable. The point is to be clear about it to yourself and in your work, as far as you are able. Fortunately, previous work must have spoken of my genuine willingness to embrace a story and all its nuance, because several agreed, during this very busy time, to speak with me. I asked all my interviewees if they had been commissioned to think about helping people manage their fear and the ending of lockdown. A SPI-B paper put forward the idea of elevating fear, so I assumed that they would have considered the exit plan. Fear impacts us mentally and physically, and it would then impede the reopening of society. Surely that would make an exit plan essential? They all seemed surprised to be asked. The idea was obviously not on the table yet. Perhaps they had been too busy fighting one fire at a time. Stott said to me that he couldn't speculate because he was far too busy in the here and now. That is understandable. But if this was an experiment in a lab, researchers wanting to scare you would need a plan for how to manage your emotions afterwards. At the end of the experiment, they would probably show you a happy film and give you a slice of chocolate cake, at the very least. You would not leave the lab scared and unhappy. The psychologists running the experiment would have been through a very rigorous ethics process. We would have signed consent forms to agree to be frightened. I know I didn't sign a consent form. It would seem that this live experiment has no ethics committee and no exit plan. Actually, I doubt it would get past the ethics committee. Stott was careful to point out that his answers were personal reflections, but that's partly why I was worried. I had a breakthrough. It seems very obvious in retrospect. When I realized this group of experts were bringing their own personalities, biases and beliefs to the table. In effect, they were fully fleshed out humans, not faceless experts. In the early days of the epidemic, SAGE and SPI-B members were anonymous. The summaries of meetings were published, but they were fairly clean. You don't know who said what, how easily they reached consensus or when they disagreed. You'll never know which informal conversations, outside the room, gave the biggest policy decisions dynamite. Because of that infamous SPI-B document, some people have assumed that SPI-B advisors are powerful, caricature villains. They are well thought of in their fields, and highly qualified. The power is harder to ascertain, because their role is to provide answers and proposals in response to Cobra and SAGE requests. In the papers, you can sometimes discern the political persuasions and biases of the SPI-B team. For instance, right-wing libertarians would be unlikely to reach towards collectivism as often as SPI-B does. The papers read like proposals from mainly left-wing academics. In the questions behind the papers you can read the political intent of the policymakers. In the obvious example of options for increasing adherence to social distancing measures, SPI-B has been asked how to make people adhere to the rules. One answer is obviously to legislate. The advisors are telling the politicians what they want to know, as well as giving behavioral insight about how to achieve that. It would be remarkable indeed if the advisors went in a completely different direction. It is well known in advisory circles that scientific advice is inherently political. Where the SPI-B advisors have sometimes wielded an additional and weighty power is speaking to the press and from their own social media pulpits. A very consistent source of discontent among the SPI-B team is that the government often ignores their advice, which means that they aren't quite as powerful as people on the outside might think. As Stott said to me, it's self-evident that government policy is at odds with the advice they are given. It was apparent to me from the SPI-B documents that one of the government's biggest fears was social unrest, even riots, and Stott would have the experience to anticipate and advise. One of the first concerns was that there could be protests or riots in response to lockdown, he said. The idea in February of ending football matches, shutting pubs, making people not go to work for months on end, closing schools seemed unprecedented. Unthinkable. Our advice revolved around inequality and not doing things to amplify perceptions of illegitimacy. Within all of this, the people who suffer the most are the poor, and where they suffer harm as a result of control measures, the potential for police to exacerbate social conflict would be quite profound. There have been protests, but not the dreaded riots. I commented to Stott that there was a strange pivot in the country's attitude to protest in the summer. One day, the general attitude was that we needed to protect the elderly and vulnerable by staying inside, old lives matter, and the next, people were protesting, Black Lives Matter, and the world took to the streets. Stott retorted it was simply about priorities, but he obviously disapproved of inhibiting the right to protest. The right to assemble is a basic human right. It's protected under the European Convention of Human Rights. Any government that takes the right away is taking massive steps in what we think of as democracy. He was excoriating on the emergency legislation to prohibit protest and the fines for organizing and attending. It's a very pernicious piece of legislation, he told me, and it has massive and negative implications for the reach of government. He was also disapproving of the large fines for breaking self-isolation. A common theme from the SPI-B advisors was that encouragement is more effective than punishment. The conversation took a frosty turn when I asked him about the effect of groupthink within SPI-B. This is a phenomenon where the natural desire for harmony within a group means that people will set aside their personal beliefs and adopt, at least outwardly, the beliefs of the group. The SPI-B papers only reflect consensus, and I wondered if they always achieved that in their meetings. He threw me when he said, "Groupthink is a completely flawed concept, developed around the inherent pathology of the group that undermines rationality and critical thinking. That is not what is going on. Groups don't have a tendency towards conformity, and I can absolutely guarantee you that groupthink is a myth." I told him I'd look this up. Indeed, I checked with a couple of psychologists who were surprised at the idea that groupthink had been so confidently debunked. Naomi Murphy, clinical and forensic psychologist, told me that within the NHS, teams try and guard against groupthink as they are aware of the dangers. She made an additional interesting point that video calls will be affecting group dynamics in ways we can't fully understand yet. These behavioral insight, war room, meetings are not happening in a room. They are happening in disparate studies and sitting rooms around the country. How does that affect communication and consensus? The National Association of Scholars, NAS, in the U.S. published a report in 2018 entitled The Irreproducibility Crisis of Modern Science. 2 Sadly, I don't think the UK government, civil service or the advising scientists appear to have read it. The NAS and the report's authors are concerned with the use and abuse of statistics, irreproducibility of results and political groupthink in science, saying that the intersection between these issues is very much what is wrong with modern science. They summarize that an entire academic discipline can succumb to groupthink and create a professional consensus with a strong tendency to reinforce itself, reject results that question its foundations, and dismiss dissenters as troublemakers and cranks, and that this particularly affects those fields with obvious policy implications, such as social psychology and climate science. The problem is, the scientists in the midst of this don't see it. My video call with Stott ended swiftly after my next question, which was about the use of fear. I asked him what he thought of the ethics of fear being used to influence people. He said, "At the time it was about what might be necessary going into lockdown. We'd have been asked to consider what level of behavioral changes might be needed." I tried again, specifically querying the trade-off in making people more frightened if it is, for the greater good. He responded that it was a reflection on people who might not think COVID will affect them. Again I probed, pointing out that statistically most people won't be much affected, that COVID will not be serious or lethal for the majority. Therefore, is it acceptable on that basis to make people think they are more at risk than they are? He said, "There you go then," and our video call dropped from frosty to Arctic and we wound up. SPI-B's remit does not involve questioning the data. The government provided facts that they work with, and Stott didn't like my train of questioning. If your SPI-B advisor, or civil service behavioral psychologist thinks the country is facing the apocalypse to end all apocalypses, and presumably they were told to treat the Imperial College London modelling as de facto, then they might think the ends utterly justify the means. Although you would hope they would still be constrained by the ethics of their professional bow. Dies and Training. Robert Dingwall. a professor of sociology who sits on various government advisory panels, was far more open on the subject of fear. In his view, fear passed its sell-by date by the end of April, although he took a nuanced view that fear might have been an appropriate tool at the beginning when we thought the virus might be an existential threat. His concern was that since then, there had not been a wider debate about alternative strategies and that, the narrow base of advice given to the government was following a very narrow subset of science. A struggle is happening within government between those who think the policies are disproportionate and the medics who have colonized the expert panels. While I have postulated in this book that aspects of our government resemble a technocracy, or a psychocracy, Dingwall worries that the upper echelons of government and advisors are leaning towards iatrocracy, a system whereby the doctors and scientists are in charge. It is understandable for doctors and scientists to be dedicated to the pursuit of health, but Dingwall sees the problem as a lack of challenge and diversity. Ultimately, he believes we need to learn to live with COVID. We have never thought it necessary to inflict social distancing and mask wearing for influenza, even though that can carry off 50,000 people in a bad year. We live with the threat of infectious disease at a minor level every day. The anonymous scientific advisor deeply embedded in Whitehall I interviewed in Chapter 5, The Business of Fear and the Unelected Psychocrats, believes the narrow base of advice Dingwall talked about has been deliberately cultivated for years. There used to be rebels, and that was good, because you can learn from the rebels. Labour liked the rebels. During the coalition under Cameron, rebels became a little less popular. Then they disappeared. They think the teams of experts have been recruited for their unified approaches and in order to align with political intent. Once the panel is assembled, they are given the injects as facts. In the first instance in this epidemic it was that 500,000 would die, and it was not their job to consider whether the facts were correct or not. Quite simply, questions are not welcomed. You aren't allowed to fight the information, they said. The anonymous scientist characterized a homogeneity of thinking and groupthink among the SPI-B team. SPI-B interpret dissent as bad. Rosa Parks didn't get off the bus. SPI-B would not have liked Rosa. The behavioral psychologists are arrogant and they have no rebellion in them. I certainly got a sense from all my interviewees. Admittedly, this is only through several conversations with several advisors, of common themes and a consistency in approach among SPI-B. They like terms like co-creation, co-design, co-production, collectivism, in it together, and solidarity, words which are strewn throughout the SPI-B documents on the government website. Depending on your ideological perspective, these might be seen as admirable qualities, but I can see how they could accompany a dislike for dissent. They must also have in common a belief in the appropriateness of a behavioral science approach to an epidemic, or they wouldn't be on the team. And I detected politicization in their approaches and advice, which is arguably inevitable, but could be skewing their advice disadvantageously. My chat with Dr. Daisy Fancourt was very pleasant. I think she would have been okay with Rosa Parks. She is an associate professor in behavioral science and health at UCL and runs the COVID Social Study, a longitudinal social and psychological study into the impact of the epidemic and lockdowns. She feeds research into the advising panels including SPI-B. She was recommended to me by Susan Michie, professor of health psychology and director of the Center for Behavior Change at UCL. Michie didn't have time for an interview, which is not surprising as she sits on SAGE, SPI-B and Independent SAGE. Fancourt told me that one of the strengths early on in the pandemic was that we were all in this together. She believed that had encouraged compliance and social cohesion. My impression from some of the interviewees was that they liked collectivism for itself, but also because it breeds adherence to the rules. I asked her about the use of fear as a tactic to encourage adherence. One of the things that was effective was increasing the idea that you shouldn't pass it to others, she said, as people are concerned about spreading the virus to neighbors and families. Some of the less effective policies are on the threat to yourself. Appeals to collective conscience are more effective. That made sense. But then she uncritically mentioned one of my personal bête noirs. Don't kill Granny. which was good for compliance. For one thing, some young people will have lost grandparents during the epidemic, making this quite an insensitive catchphrase. Back in March 2020, Neil Ferguson said that 2/3 of the people who would go on to die from COVID might die anyway during the year because these are people at the end of their lives or have underlying conditions. Point 3 Given that, should children and young people be burdened with this level of responsibility in order to encourage compliance? Fancourt told me about the huge role of psychology and behavioral science as the epidemic continues. She thinks they can be used to heal trauma and grief, ease mental health problems, treat frontline healthcare workers experiencing trauma, and heal the divisions sown by the epidemic. In her opinion, behavioral science would be needed to encourage people to use vaccines. We won't get out of this unless people have vaccines. She expanded. Most people are worried that because the vaccines have been developed quickly, safety stages have been missed out, and they have not. We need to make sure the information about vaccines comes from different sources. It mustn't look like it's propaganda. It needs to come from faith leaders, influencers, local leaders. Anti-vaxxers aren't bad people, they just have concerns that need addressing. We need to make people want to have the vaccine, not feel like they must have it. Wouldn't simply seeing the full data from trials and post-launch convince people? Wouldn't longer-term safety data be part of that? Because despite Fancourt's assurances that safety stages have not been missed out, people will be aware that medium and longer-term side effects won't have emerged? And was she basically saying that propaganda is acceptable as long as it doesn't look like it's propaganda? On the 22nd of October 2020, SPI-B published a paper entitled Role of Community Champions Networks to Increase Engagement in Context of COVID-19. Evidence and Best Practice, which is ostensibly about test and trace, but puts forward the general idea that community champions are volunteers who, with training and support, help improve the health and well-being of their families, communities or workplaces. While the document pushes the idea of co-creation, often mentioned by the SPI-B advisors, it's about how to use champions to influence, rather than genuinely co-create. The question came from government. The strategy comes from SPI-B, and the next step is lining up the champions, who presumably will tailor the messaging, but not the objectives. The term, community champions, also has a slight ring of the bloc policing that has been, and still is, widely used in communist regimes, where individuals are asked to report anti-social behavior and promote pro-social acts by their neighbors. Two of the SPI-B advisors who agreed to talk to me were adamant they could only be fully honest if they were anonymous, to protect their reputations and future careers. I'm going to call them SPI-1 and SPI-2. I know, this is not ideal. SPI-1 is high up in their professional body and, as such, I was very keen to talk to them. Like Fancourt, they also brought up the vaccine, telling me, without a vaccine, psychology is your main weapon. You have to restrict ways in which people mix and the virus can spread. Psychology has had a really good epidemic actually. I asked them which psychologists had particularly stood out. They mentioned Susan Michie, who had been unable to speak with me, and told me that she is particularly fantastic on the messaging. This brought me on to the intersection of scientific advice and politics. Michie is a member of the Communist Party of Britain, which wants a revolutionary transformation of society, to end capitalism and create a socialist state of Britain. I had been surprised that a Communist Party member was advising the government through two important advisory panels. Might such revolutionary views influence her advice? She iced China's response on Twitter on the 14th of March. China has a socialist, collective system, whatever criticisms people may have. Not an individualistic, consumer-oriented, profit-driven society badly damaged by 20 years of failed neoliberal economic policies. #Learn lessons. I'm not sure the people who were welded into their apartments in China would agree with this rose-tinted view of collectivism, or the Uyghurs, or those who are blacklisted, once discredited, everywhere restricted, using China's government surveillance social credit system. It's interesting how people's personal politics sit with this. said SPI-1. Susan Michie, who I think's been outstanding, is a member of the Communist Party, yes. I'm not sure how helpful her criticisms of the government are. The attack on neoliberalism and the whole culture of individuality is rooted in the collective. The we group identity. This is powerful psychology at the moment. In general, the pandemic hasn't exactly always brought the best out in people, and the science-politics interface is both very interesting and problematic. I asked if personal politics interfere with the quality of advice. SPI-1 turned it round, saying that they believed the more right-wing and populist governments had not managed the epidemic as well. As the irreproducibility crisis of modern science notes, some of the groupthink afflicting scientific research is political. Numerous studies have shown that the majority of academics are liberals and progressives, with relatively few moderates and scarcely any conservatives among their ranks. Politicized groupthink can bias scientific and social scientific research in any field that acquires a political coloration. SPI-1 warned me that people use the pandemic to grab power and drive through things that wouldn't happen otherwise. They were concerned about some of the policies the government were enacting, possibly using COVID as a proxy. We have to be very careful about the authoritarianism that is creeping in. They told me that there was a more pressing problem with science and politics. The advice might depend on who pays the advisors. Frankly, I was surprised there was not more of a clamor to understand the financial interests and funding behind the various advisors to government during the epidemic. More interestingly, they observed that psychologists tend to be more on the neurotic end of the spectrum. I personally have been taking COVID very seriously. I go in shops, but I don't go in cafes. There is a madness in psychology at the moment. Suddenly every psychologist and undergraduate in the country is at looking this. And that is partly an anxiety management thing. Perhaps the strategy to frighten the country was ignited in the crucible of the psychologist's own anxieties. I asked my standard question. Had it been ethical to frighten people, for the greater good? You need to frighten people, they affirmed. There is something frightening about pandemics. The number of deaths in Italy meant it was responsible for the public to be informed about how dangerous it was, for their own safety. Young people, particularly people under 55, seem to be quite safe. How do you alert people to the fact there is a serious life-threatening illness they can get without putting the fear of God into them? We live with the knowledge we are going to die, but we don't normally think the person we are going to shake hands with could kill us. This seemed at the heart of the issue ethically. Is it acceptable to implement a campaign of fear when the threat does not apply equally to everyone? One SPI-B paper spelled out clearly that the messaging should be transparent about uncertainty where present, in order to earn trust. 6. But this had not been reflected in ministers' speeches, or in scientific briefings, or in advertising. As an example, one government advertisement, targeted at the young, showed teenage lads sitting in a park, with the message, "Don't meet up with mates. Hanging out in parks could kill." Providing tabulations of relative risk in advertisements wouldn't work, obviously, but does overstating risk to people who are clearly not in the risk category engender trust? It doesn't take long for young people to suss out they aren't at risk, so what was to be gained long-term by pretending they were? The government tried to democratize the risk of COVID, when in fact it was highly patterned and age-stratified. I thought of how Jane, P76, said she wouldn't trust the government again if there was another epidemic. She was just one example of how simple messaging, which may have the best intentions, can backfire if not honest. I mentioned Jane to SPI-1 and said she suffered panic attacks every morning for weeks, and scoured the news for stories of hope. Had SPI-B ever been commissioned to give people hope? Apparently not. Another call for transparency came from SPI-B member Gavin Morgan, an educational psychologist. With his educational focus, he worried about the impact of school closures on children's mental health and learning, especially the more needy kids with mental health issues and behavioral problems. He said that the longer lockdown went on, the more kids will be affected. The more broken pieces there will be to pick up. He did a lot of work with SPI-B to get schools in a position where they could reopen in the summer, but he found the willingness was not there. The government had created so much fear that there was a lot of misplaced concern from parents and teachers about the risk level. In his view, this stems from the government's concern that people wouldn't follow lockdown rules. They went overboard with the scary message to get compliance. They were pushing at an open door, because there was already fear. Effectively, locking down schools was easy and unlocking was very difficult because of fear. The government's campaign was too effective. I asked if a more honest and transparent communication of risk might not have reduced the difficulties with schools. He agreed, and used the term, co-creation, again. In his opinion, the Department for Education, teachers and parents should have jointly developed plans, which would have led to more honesty, a better understanding of risk, and ultimately they would all have been invested in the plans and owned the solution. His great success with schools was preventing the use of masks in schools, at least initially. He was adamant that teachers and pupils should not wear masks in classrooms, telling me, younger kids, speech and communication needs are predicted on being able to see an adult's mouth when they are talking. We take in so much when we interact with people, the non-verbal, eyes and mouth. It's massive if you take away half of people's faces. There isn't any empirical evidence because this is all new, but we can relay theories about human development. Young people and children could be hugely affected. Masks dehumanize people. Given that he thought masks dehumanize people, and that the evidence that they help prevent transmission is weak, I wondered how the SPI-B advisors felt about them. I was not surprised that he told me that the group was split. As he said, they are not a panacea and the evidence is not clear-cut. But he told me that some of the group like masks because they convey a message of solidarity. In other words, there is a behavioral science reason for wearing masks, to increase a sense of collectivism. This is a feeling favored by the psychologists that is entirely unrelated to the scientific evidence regarding transmission. Essentially, they want us to feel like we are in it together. During the course of writing this book I spoke to Morgan a few times. I liked him. He was open, where others were sometimes guarded, and he enjoyed the process of our interviews, because they encouraged him to look at different perspectives. When I spoke to him again in early 2021 I got the impression his involvement had been dialed down a little. The government gave very strong guidance that secondary school pupils should wear masks in classrooms when schools reopened on the 8th of March 2021. I asked him what was behind this new policy. It's gone quiet. We've gone from regular meetings to just being commissioned for different projects, he said. There was no consultation about face masks in schools. I asked him why. I don't know. I have raised the questions a few times with other SPI-B members and with people who also sit on SAGE. We don't know why we weren't consulted. It seemed strange that the government had a willing educational psychologist ready and waiting to provide pro bono advice, and not to take advantage. I asked if he thought he wasn't being consulted because he gave the wrong sort of advice. He paused and then offered a diplomatic answer. It's becoming more streamlined, which is sensible. Right. But he'd fought hard to prevent masks being used in classrooms before. Were they weeding out the wild cards? Maybe, he agreed. I wondered what he thought of this U-turn on masks in classrooms. He reiterated the same kind of points he'd made before, perhaps expressed even more strongly. He pointed out that masks aren't even questioned anymore. It's like a seatbelt in a car. What the public would tolerate, accept, and even wanted, had shifted. At this stage, an unevaluated mass testing program had also started in secondary schools, with pupils taking 3 tests to return to school, and thereafter 2 per week. I asked him what he thought about the impact of this. It's one more thing that schools are being asked to do, he told me. Fair play to teachers. They are doing it, but they do roll over without any challenge. It assuages the government. They are trying to keep parents on board and reassure people it is safe to go back to school. But what about the pupils? How did he think this might make them feel? Anything invasive like that feels like a threat. We don't send children to school to be prodded. And for what end really? I don't know if mass testing will do any good. Morgan was the only SPI-B advisor I spoke to who emphasized that we should have been thinking about the finish line from the beginning. There was a lot of positive goodwill about wanting to lock down and we rushed into it. I cautioned that we would need an exit plan. I asked if they were thinking yet about the exit plan. He said no. Depressingly, he commented that, "We've seen how much people are willing to give up their freedom since March." I asked him how we would alleviate fear and get back to normal. I had the feeling that he agreed with me that we should try and get back to normal, in contrast to Clifford Stott. He hoped that a vaccine and track and trace would help, but ultimately the greatest aid to encouraging compliance and reducing fear would be open, honest and truthful government. He didn't seem at all convinced we'd get that. We talked about the fear that enabled this trading of freedom for a sense of security. Morgan admitted to me, like SPI-1 had, that he had feared catching COVID at the beginning. People seemed to enjoy being scared. At times, and I mused that perhaps the response to COVID had revealed a craving for existential crisis that had not been met since the Second World War. Was there a deeper psychological need being expressed through this fear? He responded that, people like being scared. Think about roller coasters and horror films. They are enjoyable because we know they are safe but provide a vicarious sensation of fear. We don't have to go out hunting anymore. We're not scared of being attacked anymore. So perhaps the muscles of our evolutionary fears needed flexing. By the autumn, Morgan's fears had evolved and he worried that important aspects of human society are being taken away. If this goes on much longer, we will lose our culture. If that's taken away, then what are we? My fears have changed over 6 months. SPI-2 is the other member of SPI-B who could only speak to me honestly if I agreed to conceal their identity. They had grave concerns about the use of fear. In March, the government was very worried about compliance and they thought people wouldn't want to be locked down. There were discussions about fear being needed to encourage compliance and decisions were made about how to ramp up the fear. The way we have used fear is dystopian. We have a totalitarian government in respect to propaganda. But all governments engage with propaganda. The use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been like a weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. We talked about propaganda during the COVID epidemic, which SPI-2 felt had reached sinister levels, and they shared their suspicions with me about clap for carers. I never joined in with clap for carers. I was relieved when it was over. I would say it was created, invented. I don't think it was grassroots, they confided. We never discussed it in SPI-B. It wasn't our policy or recommendation. I just think someone, somewhere dreamt it up. It was ready to go. Something about it struck me as artificial. I bristled at the rainbows in people's windows. It felt more like a clap for Boris rather than a clap for the NHS. I think the government used it as a shield. I felt goosebumps. I had interviewed the founder of Clap for Carers, Anne-Marie Ploss, for an article one wanted to write, and had felt a strange hunch. Instead of pitching the story and portrait to a magazine as planned, I had felt stuck, unable to confirm my inklings one way or the other, so I just dropped it. SPI-2's conjecture echoed my hunch, and it was not the first time someone close to government had shared suspicions that Clap for Carers was not the grassroots sensation it seemed. It might be that Clap for Carers was invented by one of the covert propaganda units in the government. Or maybe it really did originate with Ploss. She seemed genuine. I do believe her on this, but was turbocharged to become a visible nationwide campaign with government help. It injected the early days of the lockdown with a feeling of hope and humanity. It encouraged the collectivism so beloved of the behavioral scientists. But something felt off, artificial, as SPI-2 said. The government has formed for manipulating emotion this way, which I explore in Chapter 7, The Tools of the Trade, and Chapter 8, Controlled Spontaneity and Propaganda. We concluded our thought-provoking conversation. SPI-2 told me they felt we had lost the balance between protecting people from a virus and protecting what makes us human. Again, This resonated deeply with my fears for the future when we first locked down. I asked how this could have happened. After a pause, SPI-2 confessed, "I don't want to contemplate it. We've allowed ourselves to be governed in this way." I pressed on. Didn't they want to know? They were part of the propaganda engine. So didn't they want to know where we were being driven and why? It's in the name of the unit I am in. It's behavior. You could call psychology mind control. That's what we do, they said. Clearly we try and go about it in a positive way, but it has been used nefariously in the past. Psychology has been used for wicked ends. I don't want to get too into this because it's dystopian and it's what wakes me up at 3 a.m.